So they have physically attached those hoist rings and connected the lifting lines, and now they are preparing to lift the Dragon Endurance spacecraft onto the Shannon recovery boat momentarily. And you did just see that live look of the recovery member as he jumped off of the spacecraft and into the Pacific Ocean and is now back on one of the fast boats. And those fast boats were some of the initial recovery ships or recovery vehicles out at the splashdown location.
And again, we heard those comms to the crew, notifying them to prepare for the lift. Again, they can't see very much outside of the spacecraft, so knowing what operations are happening helps them understand what those moves that they're feeling are, so they know what to expect.
And once they begin that lift, it takes less than 10 minutes or so for it to be completed. And so it'll be safely inside that basket there at the end of the ship, where the dragon's egg, or dragon's nest is what it's known as. And then about 10 minutes or so from then, it'll be ready for hatch open. And you do see that lift is now underway as the Dragon Endurance spacecraft makes its way onto the recovery ship, the Shannon, that is staged off the coast of San Diego, California, following splashdown of the Dragon Endurance and the Crew-10 astronauts currently aboard.
And as this is happening, the crew is still strapped in to their seats with the 5-point harnesses, and they'll remain strapped in through the translation of the spacecraft to the deck and until the medical officer actually greets them. Then they will begin to unbuckle themselves and start egressing the spacecraft.
And so Dragon will remain in the nest during the crew extraction and then for the journey back to port. So that lift of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft just happened.
Stand by for translation to egress platform.
Dragon copies.
And so that lift of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft is now complete. You can see it there on your screen, safely in the nest on the recovery ship. And so that translation to bring it forward and closer into the ship to then prepare to open the hatches will begin momentarily. You can see some of the crew member or the recovery members there doing their final inspections and safety checks of the spacecraft before they begin that translation. And then once that translation of the spacecraft is complete on the SpaceX recovery ship, the hatches will be opened. And we do expect that to take place probably in about 10 to 15 minutes from now. And once open, a SpaceX medical doctor will be the first one to check in on McClain, Nichole, Ayers, Takuya Onishi, and Kirill Peskov, and see if they are ready for egress or getting out of the spacecraft. And while Dragon's top hatch is used to connect to the space station, the astronauts will actually egress or exit from Dragon's side hatch, pending capsule orientation in the water. Of course, we did see that it splashed down in orientation 1, so the nose cone was facing up, which is the preferred orientation. And so before opening the hatch, the spacecraft's cabin pressure must be equalized with the outside environment. And then once the hatch is open, that will be the crew's first breath of fresh air since boarding their spacecraft at the start of their journey last March. Again, they lifted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida on March 14th of this year.
And it's important to note that Anne, Nichole, Takuya, and Kirill will be getting assistance from the recovery teams while exiting the spacecraft. This is the same process for any returning long-duration crew members, as returning to a gravity environment can wreak havoc with our vestibular system responsible for maintaining balance and motion. Safety is our #1 priority and with this operation, so you'll see the crew members helped out of the spacecraft one by one and assisted the few feet to the medical quarters aboard the boat.
And if you've ever watched crews return on a Soyuz, 2 of our crew members today had actually previously flown on a Soyuz, and McClain and Takuya Onishi. This is the same process as when astronauts are carried from the Soyuz capsule to waiting chairs on the steppe of Kazakhstan and then carried to a waiting medical tent. This is also the period where any time-critical cargo can be recovered from the spacecraft, with the remainder waiting until the ship is back in port.
Once the ship and spacecraft return to shore, the recovery team will perform additional inspections before loading Dragon onto a flatbed truck at the SpaceX facility in Cape Canaveral for post-processing.
So we mentioned earlier all of the science and research that Crew-10 conducted during their 5-month mission aboard the International Space Station. So in addition to some of the physical and biological science experiments that they conduct, they too themselves are human research subjects. So a lot of teams work to gather samples from the crew throughout their mission to see how the microgravity environment of space actually impacts the human body. So NASA does have the Human Research Program, which is responsible for a lot of that science and investigation. But of course, there's also researchers outside of NASA that use the microgravity environment aboard the International Space Station to conduct their science and research. We do have the International Space Station National Laboratory that helps to facilitate a lot of that other research as well.
And those research experiments, especially with the human body, are extremely important, especially for, we call these long duration missions 5 to 6 months long, but if we're going to be going to the moon, planets like Mars, we're going to need to stay a lot longer, and we're going to need to know how to keep the human body healthy throughout that time. What happens in these microgravity environments, and how can we better prepare the humans for going on these even longer duration missions.
So the International Space Station does serve as sort of a testing and proving ground for NASA's future Artemis missions to the moon and then on to Mars. Of course, we can't necessarily do all science and research in the microgravity environment due to various factors. So teams on the ground also do what are known as analog research experiments. Also, a lot of that is based out of our Human Research Program. So one of those, known as the Human Exploration Research Analog, or HERA, does some isolation and confinement research inside of an analog setup that's supposed to simulate a spacecraft. Another one of those analogs is known as CHAPEA, or the Crew Health and Exploration Research Analog, which actually simulates a stay on the surface of Mars for about a year. So while this International Space Station does do a lot of great research, some of that research can also be done on the ground in preparation for those long-duration exploration missions to the moon and Mars.
And you can see on your screen, the Dragon spacecraft is now translating forward to that deck that we saw earlier. Again, that deck is the height just below the hatch, which will make it a lot easier for the crew to egress the spacecraft.
And so right before that translation took place, a couple of the recovery team members did do some final safety checks of the spacecraft to ensure that it was safe and ready to go for additional people to approach the spacecraft and to begin those hatch open preparations and operations to get Crew-10 out of the spacecraft and back on Earth. For those of you who are just joining us, Crew-10 did safely splash down about 40 minutes ago off the coast of San Diego, California, aboard a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft known as Endurance. Endurance did fly on 3 previous missions, Crew-3, Crew-5, and Crew-9. So this was the 4th flight of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft. It launched to the International Space Station about 5 months ago on March 14th from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Following that launch, it had a journey to the International Space Station where it was then docked and remained for about 5 months for all of that science and research that Crew-10 conducted. And then yesterday at 3:15 p.m. Pacific, 6:15 p.m. Eastern, Dragon and the Crew-10 crew safely undocked from the International Space Station and made their way back to Earth. They had an about 17.5-hour journey from that undocking until their splashdown, which again took place at 8:33 a.m. Pacific, 11:33 a.m. Eastern today. Crew-10 again is comprised of NASA astronauts Sam McClain and Nichole Ayers, along with JAXA or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. And so we are now just standing by for. I love how IT people always use like, I have no idea. Reseat it.
Stand by. All right, as you see there, we're just listening in and watching as the space crew, and they're back on. We did lose that feed for just a second here, but it's back.
So that hatch on the Dragon Endurance spacecraft is now open, and teams are working to get Crew-10 out and back on Earth. Again, they will be initially checked out by a SpaceX medical director. You did just see him go in there a moment ago to make sure that they are feeling okay and are ready to egress or exit the spacecraft.
We are also seeing the recovery crew install that hatch seal protection. This helps protect both the seal of the hatch on the spacecraft as well as the crew as they're exiting the vehicle.
And so that hatch was officially opened at 9:10 a.m. Pacific, 12:10 p.m. Eastern Time, following a splashdown at 8:33 a.m. Pacific, 11:33 a.m. Eastern off the coast of San Diego, California. Again, they are doing some initial medical evaluations, and then they will be prepared to egress or exit the spacecraft and take their first breath of fresh air. Again, they will be assisted out of the spacecraft. That is completely normal. And then from there, they will go just a few steps and to do some additional medical checkouts. And then after the egress is finally complete and all 4 crew members are out of the spacecraft, they will take a helicopter back to dry land. And then from there in California, they will then aboard a NASA plane and make their way back home to Houston, Texas.
You can see the recovery team again preparing for that egress or exiting the spacecraft. They are using some aids. There's going to be a little bit of a ramp to enable the crew to easily exit the spacecraft. Instead of taking that large step, they can use that ramp to exit.
And recovering the crew is a bit of a joint operation. So we do have team members from NASA's Flight Operations Directorate out there, as well as NASA's Commercial Crew Program, and some flight surgeons from the NASA and international partners that will be prepared to retrieve and receive the crew following their egress or exit from the spacecraft. So it'll be nice to see some familiar faces, friendly faces, as they've worked with all of these teams in preparation for their space flight, and they will be greeting them upon their return.
You can see that the crew is removing some of their cargo that looked like their tablets that they were using to follow along with every procedure throughout the entire mission. and ride on Dragon.
And after the crew is extracted or egressed out of the spacecraft, they will remove some additional cargo that's time critical. Often that is cargo that needs to be chilled for whatever reason, scientific samples and such that need to be in a specific environment. So that will be immediately offloaded after the crew exits the spacecraft, and then any additional cargo will be offloaded after it makes its way back to port off the coast of San Diego, California.
Looks like those are the footrests being removed. That allow the crew to get out of their seats a little bit easier.
You do see one of those beds or slides that they use to help extract the crew, so we should see some of that egress taking place momentarily.
If you're just now joining us, you are watching the Crew-10 mission as we await the 4 crew members, NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nichole Ayers, JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov egress the Dragon spacecraft here shortly. They just recently, in the last 10 minutes, were able to take the first breath of fresh air in about 5 months. So we're excited to see them stand with gravity for the first time in 5 months.
And so they will likely be assisted, so we might not see the first steps, but they will be assisted out of the capsule. And it is important to note, since they were under the microgravity environment, their muscles, their bones, all of their systems haven't been exposed to Earth's gravity in over 5 months, which of course has some impacts on the human body, which is some of the important research that is done on the International Space Station to actually see how the human body is affected by the environment of outer space. And so that hatch did open about 6 minutes ago at 9:10 a.m. Pacific, 12:10 p.m. Eastern, following a splashdown at 8:33 a.m. Pacific, 11:33 a.m. Eastern, off the coast of California. Following that splashdown, the recovery team went out to meet the Dragon Endurance spacecraft. First out were the 2 fast boats, which began some safety checks and also began to safe the spacecraft in preparation to be lifted onto the recovery vessel, the Shannon. And the Shannon did arrive to the splashdown location less than 30 minutes after splashdown to then lift the spacecraft up on board the Shannon, and now we're just awaiting the crew to exit or egress the spacecraft. It does look like they are preparing for that crew egress here in just a moment. And the first Crew-10 crew member has now successfully egressed or exited the capsule. And that is NASA astronaut Anne McClain. She looks very excited to be back on Earth, given an arm pump. And the other 3 crew members should be following behind here shortly. So just moments ago, we did have NASA astronaut Anne McClain make her way out of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft, and now we are just standing by for the egress or exit of the following 3 Crew-10 crew members to complete the recovery process. So we are standing by for the egress of NASA astronaut Nichole Ayers, JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi, and Roscosmonaut Kirill Peskov. And the second Crew-10 crew member has successfully egressed the capsule, and that is NASA astronaut Nichole Ayers. So both NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nichole Ayers have successfully egressed or exited the capsule. Anne McClain served as the Crew-10 commander, and Nichole Ayers served as the Crew-10 pilot for this mission. So the final 2 crew members that we are awaiting are JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. You did just see them removing 2 additional foot restraints, likely preparing to egress the final 2 Crew-10 crew members.
If you're just now joining us, NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nichole Ayers have already egressed or exited the Dragon Endurance spacecraft. And again, we are waiting for the final 2 Crew-10 members to exit. JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov are still inside of the Dragon spacecraft.
So the crew did complete a 148-day mission, with 146 of those days docked to the International Space Station. During that time, they completed more than 2,300 orbits around the Earth, traveling more than 62.7 million statute miles. And NASA astronaut Anne McClain, who was the first to exit the spacecraft, has now totaled 352 total days in space. This was her second space flight. Her previous mission was aboard a Soyuz spacecraft. And then this was the first space flight for NASA astronaut Nichole Ayers, who was the second to exit the spacecraft. So she now has 148 days in space. And we do now see JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi has exited the spacecraft. And this was also the second space flight for Onishi. So across his 2 missions, he has now totaled 263 days in space. So we are now just standing by for the final crew member of Crew-10 to make their way out of the spacecraft, and that is Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. To recap a little bit, the Crew-10 mission launched aboard a Falcon 9 rocket inside a Dragon spacecraft, which you're now seeing on your screen. That launch took place from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida on March 14th. The crew then had a journey to the space station and docked shortly thereafter, spending about 5 months attached to the orbiting laboratory, conducting science and research before undocking yesterday, August 8th at 3:15 p.m. Pacific, 6:15 p.m. Eastern, for a 17.5-hour return journey back to Earth, splashing down off the coast of San Diego, California earlier this morning at 8:33 a.m. Pacific, 11:33 a.m. Eastern, which was less than an hour ago. And they are working to egress the final crew member. The initial 3 crew members have already safely exited the spacecraft, and those are NASA astronauts and McClain and Nichole Ayers, along with JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi. So the egress of Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov is now underway, and you can see him making his way out of the spacecraft right now. And there you have Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov waving as he takes his final or initial steps on Earth. And he will now be taken back to some additional medical checks. And with that, all 4 Crew-10 crew members are safely back on Earth. They have all egress.